So welcome everyone. Welcome to Bangkok and OARC 30. In case it's not obvious, this is the 30th DNS-OARC meeting that we've held. Our second time in Asia, I believe. The last one was Beijing 10 years ago, which was a very exciting meeting for me. I was working for DNS-OARC back then, and I think, if I remember correctly, we wanted to come to Beijing earlier, but there was some health scare and we had to cancel and reschedule and ended up coming in 2009, and I enjoyed that trip very much. So being that 30 is an interesting round number, I couldn't help but look back at over the years and think about how many DNS-OARCs there have been. We've been doing this for about 15 years now. And if you go back and look at some of those older meetings, it's very interesting to see that we're still talking about some of the same topics that we're talking about back then, such as botnets and DDoS attacks and root servers in any cast and things like that. So if you have some time, maybe go back to the archives and look at some of those old presentations. It's kind of fun. We have about 170 attendees, I believe, today, which is a wonderful number. Our first meetings, we were in the range of 20. So obviously, we're growing over the years, and I think we'll continue to grow. Please keep coming, and please keep supporting DNS-OARC. We very much appreciate that. I wanted to call out that if you've been here in the recent days, of course, you know that Mr. Paul Vixie is here, and he was sort of the co-founder of DNS-OARC, along with Casey Claffey from CADA. And Paul doesn't always come to the DNS-OARC meetings these days, but it's great to have him here. And so if you have a chance, introduce yourself and say hi to Paul. And I'd very much like to thank Paul for his foresight in starting this organization 15 years ago and getting us to where we are today. So thank you, Paul. And before I turn it over to Keith, I just want to say, if you don't know, tomorrow is Mother's Day. At least where I'm from, it's Mother's Day. And although my mother is not watching, I believe my wife is watching the webcast this morning. So happy Mother's Day, Anne. Hello, Colin. Hello, Gabby. We have an exchange student living with us from Gabby, an exchange from New Zealand living with us. Her name is Gabby, and she's been leaving these little flags in my clothes. So every morning when I put on a shirt, one of these little flags falls off into the ground, and I have a collection of them here. So thank you for that. All right, so let's get started. Keith?
Okay, thank you, Duane. I'm Keith Mitchell, OARC President. For those of you who it's your first OARC workshop, welcome. It's great to be, as Duane says, back in the Asia-Pacific region for the first time in far too long, and great to be in Thailand for the first time ever. Before I give the new people here an introduction to what OARC is about, I just want to run through a few administrative things. So the Wi-Fi is basically provided care of ICANN. So there are two SSIDs for that, depending on which part of the hotel you're in. The coffee breaks, as you can see, are in the registration area outside. Lunch will be in the hotel restaurants, so really just follow the directions of the hotel staff to the restaurant for lunch. Toilets, restrooms are just on the right there. Also, the other thing that we have going in the registration area are the software demos being run by Jerry Lindstrom, our software engineer. Please do have a look at what Jerry's got running there. He's got the latest cool stuff that he's been working on, as well as an overview of all the tools that we have. As far as lunch is concerned, or any of the food, if you have any concerns about our dietary restrictions, then please speak to Dinesh or any of the hotel staff, and they'll be happy to help. In the event of a fire alarm or other emergency, basically there are two ways out. You can either exit on the side there, and there's stairs down, or you can go back out the entranceway. Again, follow the instructions of hotel staff. What are we doing when? Tomorrow, Matt Pouncett will be running a PGP signing session. So that will be in the last half hour of the lunch break. So please speak to Matt if you want to participate in that. Matt will have a brief introduction to that tomorrow morning during the break. Lightning talks, we have room for 45 minutes, maybe 3 or 4 late-breaking talks. If there's something you would like to submit for that at the last session tomorrow, then please email your abstract to submissions sorry, that slide says 11 a.m. Monday. Actually, it's 10:30 a.m. Monday. So by the start of tomorrow's coffee break, and that will let the program committee review the slides during the coffee break. Social event this evening. We apologize, there were some email glitches where we didn't get information about this as to some of you. This is the one thing that you need to pay for this event. It's $50 registration. If you haven't already registered for that, please do so by noon today. Basically, at 6:10 this evening, assuming that we manage to finish on time, the boat will be boarding by the hotel breakfast restaurant next to. There is a room next to the restaurant which is reserved for boarding, so you don't have to hang around outside. But please be on the boat in good time, because that boat needs to be away from the pier by 6:30, because the hotel's boat's coming in right after that. But if you're going to go in, make sure you have your ticket and your name badge, and that will be cruising for 2 hours. We're webcasting on the OARC YouTube channel. Sorry about the URL. We had a nice URL, but then they killed Google+. If you're in the room, please try and not make any extraneous noises. If you have a question, please line up at the microphone and identify yourself and your affiliation before asking the question for the benefit of everyone in the room and on the webcast. If you're on the webcast and you want to ask questions remotely, then there's Jabber Room for that. There's all the usual social media stuff. Thank you all the speakers. We have, I believe, all your slide decks, but if you have any special requirements, please come and speak to Schomp or myself or any of the team on the front desk here. Please keep to time. We usually manage to do quite well with that with our work meetings. There will be some guidance from the timekeeper. The countdown that you as a speaker are getting are to the end of you speaking. There's still time after that countdown has expired for questions before the end of your slot. And try not to emit any spurious RF while you're up here. And thank you. I mean, all of our speakers come here on their own time and expense, and we would not have our workshops without the speakers. Just one final thing to remind you all that OARC has a conduct policy. This applies to all our activities, whether they're workshops or whether they're online. By registering for the event, you committed to adhere to that. Please respect that and everyone else here so we can all have a good experience. If you need help with anything, all the staff, board, and program committee have red badge lanyards. People with green lanyards, they're our first timers, so I'm sure all the old hands in the community will go out of their way to make you welcome. So that is all the admin stuff. So next slide deck, and I'll just talk a little bit about OARC itself. This workshop, we're able to provide free to everybody because of our sponsors. In particular, this is the 3rd time that ICANN have hosted one of our workshops in conjunction with the IDS workshop. We've just had 2 days of domain symposium. Big thank you to ICANN, not just for paying for everything, but also making all the staff available to help out. It really makes a difference, so thank you to ICANN. VeriSign continue to be very strong supporters of OARC, and one of the things that they're doing for the workshops is they are a patron for both of our workshops this year. It's great also to have the associate sponsor support of APNIC, given that we're in the APNIC region for the first time in ages. Again, APNIC is a great supporter of OARC. Diamond Key Security, our contributor sponsor, they have a booth outside. Please do visit and talk to them about their HSM. And the other thing that's made it really easy and straightforward to be in Thailand is the local .th registry, .ri, thnic, has given us all kinds of local help and support, which has made life a lot easier. So, on to hopefully what is a brief introduction about OARC. This is the point where all the OARC members start reading their email, but hopefully for everybody else there's something new in here. So, what is OARC here for? Basically, we're here to try and understand the DNS better, to make the DNS work better. And that's partly about DNS operations, and it's partly about research, and it's also about applying the insights of research to data that can only be obtained from the operational network, and giving research insights to the operators who don't necessarily always have the time in the thick of running their networks to step back and analyze what they're doing. We don't just provide a talking shop to do that. We also have a bunch of services and tools which run off our infrastructure. We like to help build relationships between all the players, both at the workshops and via other media that we facilitate communication. We're also into data sharing. We have a significant data set and ways of ensuring that that is shared responsibly between the operators and researchers. Workshops are important, but they're by no means the only thing that we do. And we also like to think that we manage to do some outreach and education about the DNS as well. It's a pretty arcane part of the internet, but it's a very important one. And the important thing is our members. We have slightly over 100 members. We've got a tree here. The DNS namespace is a tree hierarchy, but actually the community that we have is not a hierarchical one. We have players large and small who are all active and engaged, and it's really good to have everyone's support in that. It's quite hard to explain what is it that we do exactly. Sometimes you try and explain these things by analogy, and a few years ago, one of our team came up with this idea that we're like a library. We've got this big data set, but we also have events in the library where all the smart people hang out with the books and discuss them. But at the same time, it's not just about the data set. It's kind of like a learned society, like your Royal Society or something like that. We had another stab at this when we did a board retreat earlier this year, and the board came up with it's where DNS experts work together, which is pretty good. But really, the way I see it is the people who get the most out of being at OARC are the ones who put the most into it. If you come along and if you sign up and then you never come to the workshops, you don't post in the mailing lists, you don't share data, then you don't get much out of it. Whereas if you come along and you engage and you participate, then that's when you get the true value out of OARC. How do we do this? There's a bunch of services that we provide. The software tools that we develop, some of these we wrote in-house, some of these are tools that have been cut by the community and then maybe abandoned, and we've provided a home for them. There's a bunch of systems and services that we use to host the data set, to run test beds, to basically provide useful items. The infrastructure supports the data set. We collect the data set from our members and other parties. We take care of that data set. It's a big data set that needs a lot of care, and we facilitate the sharing of that. And if it was just about the workshops, we would probably rename ourselves DNS-NOG, but actually it's a bit more than the workshops. Our infrastructure, we have a data set which is now 1/4 petabyte or more. We've been gathering that data for 15 years, so there are various views of the DNS, and people still go back and look at the old data to do long-time sequence analysis. That's all in our main site in Fremont, California. We also have analysis servers that the members can use to crunch the data. Most of our tool software is public domain, open source on GitHub. There's a bunch of testers that we run. And to make sure that our data is safe and our infrastructure is resilient, we also have additional sites in Ottawa, Canada, and Stockholm, Sweden. How do you become a member? There are various categories which are essentially based on the size of your organization, how many contacts. We have a couple of entry-level categories for organizations that are too small to afford, but we do expect participation and some contribution in kind for the supporter and blue categories. And I'm pleased to say that we have members all the way up to Diamond who provide us with substantial support. If you want to find out more about OARC membership, my colleague Sue Graves is standing at the back of the room. Talk to Sue and she'll be happy to explain it and help you sign up. A little bit about the organization itself. We've kind of got what we think is a best practice non-profit membership organization governance. We're not dependent on any other organization. We basically use our membership subscriptions and other contributions to about $800,000 a year. We have a neutrality principle. We are governed by our members. Members elect a board. The board are all here. We have half a dozen staff who are all contractors, and we have a whole bunch of volunteers. We have the program committee who generate the content, and we have various helpers with the logistics of things like the webcast and the network. And we have formal status in the US as a non-profit. All of our board members are here. So this is who they are. It's been nice that most of these board members have been in service for a couple of years or more now. And again, all very committed people who make a real difference to the organization. Most of our staff are here, and as you can see, we're all most of us are part-time. It varies depending on role exactly, and you can see that we've got a globally distributed team as well. Program committee, all but one of them are here. Most of them are pitching in at the front desk here and helping run the program. And again, we would not have the program without the program committee chasing people down for presentations and also evaluating the presentations and shepherding the presentations through to what you watch. So the workshops, we generally run 2 of these a year. We're hoping for next year to extend that to maybe an additional 1 day worth of workshop. In general, we co-locate them with other internet events. The ones that seem to work best are RIPE in Europe, NANOG in North America, and ICANN IDS, which tends to move around the world globally. The feedback we get from our attendees is it saves them a lot of time and money for us to co-locate. And it means that there's also visibility between the DNS community and the wider operations community that participates in these. And there's various ways in which we can share facilities and connectivity, which makes it easier. If you're interested in sponsoring or becoming a patron to support our workshop, again, talk to my colleague Dinesh. It makes a big difference in terms of running the workshops and keeping the costs of them down. With that, mention our next workshop, which is in October. Actually, it's a Halloween workshop. We're back in Texas, and that will be co-located with the NANOG and IRON events there. And really, I'd just like to reach out to those who are not members. I hope that by the end of 2 days of workshop that you'll consider that it's worth becoming an OARC member. How does that benefit you? You get to be in the same room as the experts, the people who really understand how the DNS works. We develop all these tools and services. If you remember, you get to be able to say what tools we develop, how we develop them. Potentially, we can even develop software for you at a discount, if you remember. You have access to the data set. Our data set is completely unique. And really is a view of how the DNS works that you can't get anywhere else. We are not a security organization. There are many other security organizations in there, but we are certainly positioned to help facilitate dealing with cybersecurity threats. You will find a lot of the presentations and analysis of our data set is actually to do with making the internet safer. And I think another important part is that we're neutral. We have an explicit neutrality policy. We're not beholden to the vested interests of any commercial parties or political agendas, and that's very important as far as the DNS is concerned as well. So, I'm not going to talk through these, but really, these are in the words of our own members, our own workshop attendees. This is what they get out of OARC. If you're new, you haven't been here before, talk to people, find out what it is that they, why they're here and how they benefit from it. Open to questions, but at this point, I think that we also need to plow on with the workshop. So with that, I will take you to the first speaker, who is Schomp. And Kyle is going to be talking about resolver selection.
Thank you. All right, good morning. So recursive resolvers have a choice, right? If you look at any particular zone, like for example, this is the dig output of edgekey.net. There's multiple NS records, 13 in our case, and each one of these records has A and possibly quad A records. A recursive resolver can ask any one of these the question and get the same answer right. So what I wanted to ask was, how do recursive resolvers choose between them and why? Now this question has been asked before. You et al. Studied specific recursive resolver software in the lab setting in 2012. And then Mother et al. More recently in 2017 actually used the RIPE Atlas platform to send probing traffic to recursive resolvers to measure their behavior. I'm going to look at this from a slightly different perspective, from the authoritative name server logs, and see what we can learn from the actual production traffic that arrives at Akamai's authoritative name servers. So there's really two reasons why I think this is a sort of an interesting question to ask. And the first is really my reason, because I work on the authoritative side primarily in my job, is that how recursive resolvers behave really informs the decisions that we make on how we deploy. For example, there are deployment strategies that we have talked about that are probably not advisable based on the results of studies like this. I'll talk about that more. The other, though, is that on the other side, for recursive resolvers, if we understand the behavior that's common today and we find limitations with it, then we can improve it in the next version of software going forward, right? So the data set I'm going to use for this is 10 minutes of Akamai's authoritative DNS server logs. All of the log entries are for the CDN domain edgekey.net, which is one of our critical domains at Akamai. It's one of the entry points to the content delivery network. Our logs only contain v4 traffic currently due to a limitation in logging, unfortunately. But it means I can only really answer questions about how recursive resolvers use the v4 delegations, not how they use the v6 delegations, whether it's the same or not, and how they prefer v4 over v6. I can't answer those questions. I only know about the v4 data. I'm also using an assumption here that the latency is fairly stable over this 10-minute period. And what I mean by that is that each delegation has a different RTT, right, per recursive resolver, based on the actual location of the recursive resolver and the location of the delegations. So if one delegation is higher latency than the other, I anticipate those to remain consistent over the 10-minute period. And I've repeated this for different times of day, different days of the week, for different CDN domains, all with 13 delegations. And the findings are very similar. So I'm just going to show one here with the understanding that it seems to generalize, at least within the realm of Akamai's data. Finally, immediately after collecting the 10 minutes of logs, I then ping each source IP address in the logs to obtain an estimate of the RTT from the recursive resolver to that delegation. This deserves a little more explanation because all of Akamai's delegations are anycast. So when a recursive resolver sends us a query, it arrives in one of the catchments, and then it ends up in the log, and I ping it from there. So we actually get the measure for that particular anycast site. However, if a recursive resolver didn't send any traffic to one of the 13 delegations, then I don't actually know where it would have been routed based on BGP, so I don't have a measure of RTT for that. So that's one of the limitations of my data set. Okay, so let's take a look at a high level of the data. There's 890,000 source IP addresses in just that 10-minute period. But this is a heavily skewed distribution, right? 90% of them sent actually less than 90 queries over 10 minutes, a very small amount of traffic. There we go. Okay, so I chose this bucket size of 90 queries, though, because if you assume a uniform distribution across a three-member set, there's a greater than 1% chance of not sampling all 13 delegations. So there's a sampling issue here, right? For certain recursive resolvers with low volumes of traffic, we might have difficulty identifying their behavior because of how infrequently they send queries to Akamai's authorities. So I'm going to focus first on these higher volume recursive resolvers that send more traffic to Akamai, and we'll come back and talk about the rest later on in the talk. Of these higher volume ones, 66% actually responded to my ping, so I have an estimate of RTT for those recursive resolvers. Okay, first result then from the data is that 25% of the recursive resolvers used all 13 delegations, in our case, all v4 13 delegations, right? There's really two takeaways, I think, from this. First, the curve up to 13 delegations is fairly smooth. It doesn't appear like there is an obvious mode, which is a promising result for Akamai because it suggests that there isn't a general trend out there to limit the number of delegations that you'll use that's below 13. It seems like you can use 13 without it being too great of an issue. However, this still shows, though, that 75% of the recursive resolvers did not use all 13. I think what this is likely indicating, and we'll see more of it, is that they're not using a uniform distribution across all 13 names, right? They're actually preferencing one delegation over another, which is somewhat expected. So let's first eliminate those ones that are using a uniform distribution. I'm going to use just the chi-square test for this, right? And 1.7% of the recursive resolvers are potentially uniform. I mean, we can't reject the null hypothesis here. It's a fairly small number of recursive resolvers that seem to use uniform distribution across all 13. If you relax this definition a little bit and you say, well, perhaps they're uniform across a subset of the delegations, so maybe they only use 10, for example, this number jumps up to 6.7%. It's still fairly low, and the real answer is probably somewhere in between here. It's a minority of recursive resolvers, though, that do this uniform. So let's look at the others then. If you go to the extreme other end from a uniform distribution, you see all of these recursive resolvers that send nearly all their traffic to a single delegation. And the graph here is a CDF, cumulative distribution function, across the resolver IP addresses of the fraction of queries sent to the most frequently used delegation, right? And then at the top right there, you see there's about 10% that sent greater than 95% of their queries to a single delegation. That choice could possibly be random, or it might be based on another variable like latency, right? So to test this, I wanted to test this, but for 5% or half, they send all of their traffic to exactly one delegation. All of those traffic. So I can't actually tell whether it's the lowest latency delegation because I don't have estimates of RTT to the other delegations. For the others, though, 3/4 use the fastest delegation for nearly all of their traffic. So I think this generally applies that the behavior of these recursive resolvers is that they're trying to use they're trying to find the lowest latency delegation and then use it for the vast majority of their traffic. But there's still then 83% of recursive resolvers that are somewhere in the middle. And here's one example on the slide here. This graph here then on the y-axis is the number of queries to each one of the delegations. And the delegations are just ordered by the number of queries, right? And this recursive resolver seems to send more traffic to the first 4 than to the others for some reason, right? So it's some sort of uneven distribution. I'm going to then calculate this unevenness for all the recursive resolvers using Shannon entropy, which is a measure of how uniform the distribution is effectively, which is this CDF then. So for a set of 13 elements, right, the maximum entropy you can have is with a uniform distribution, which is around 3.7 bits. And then the least you can have, of course, is 0, and that's when you send all of your traffic to one delegation. So if you look at the ends of this curve, they are about what you'd expect. The top left looks sort of uniform. The bottom right, of course, is one delegation used. But everything in the middle has variation. And there doesn't seem to be a common mode of how these recursive resolvers are behaving. The reason for this, I think, is that there's a latent variable in play. This. Ah, that does seem to work better. Thank you. Well, you're getting a preview. So there's a latent variable here, right? And that's latency. The previous research that I cited at the beginning had noted that recursive resolvers seem to preference lower latency delegations over high latency delegations. And this could be some sort of inverse proportionality based on RTT. The relationship may not be linear. In fact, in many cases, it doesn't appear to be. So the form of this function could vary with the particular software in play, right? In general, though, what's happening here is the recursive resolvers are discovering RTT for the delegations, and each DNS query is an opportunity to estimate that RTT, right? And then they weight the number of queries they send in the future to those delegations based upon those RTTs. Okay, so here's 3 example recursive resolvers. And this is similar graph to what I showed you before. The y-axis is still the number of queries sent to the delegation, but the x-axis now is the relative RTT from the recursive resolver to the delegation. And relative because 0 is the lowest latency, and then all the others are relative to whatever that latency was. By eye, it's kind of hard to see any clear pattern here necessarily. I'm going to take a fairly coarse-grained approach to this, and I'm going to say, let's split the delegations in half. And one half is going to be the lower latency half of delegations. The other half is going to be the higher latency half of delegations. A recursive resolver that prefers low latency delegations should send greater than 50% of its traffic to the lower latency half of delegations, right? Okay, so that's what this CDF is then. And the x-axis is the fraction of queries to the lowest latency half of delegations. Anything on the right half of this curve then should be a preference for lower latency delegations. And that seems generally true, right? 80% actually fall on the right half of the graph. Since not all recursive resolvers use all 13 delegations, I can pad this out with an assumption that unused ones are higher latency. They're unused because they're higher latency during that 10-minute period. And the number that are now preferencing lower latency delegations is 95%, which is roughly what we'd expect. Even with that, though, the preference in some recursive resolvers doesn't really look all that strong, right? There's still 20% that are sending somewhere less than 65% of their traffic to the lower latency side of the delegations. We can see what the impact this has on resolution time as well, though. So this graph here shows the average additional round trip time that these recursive resolvers are using over the lowest latency delegation based on these estimates of RTT, right? So we know what the lowest latency delegation is then, and we know what the average resolution time was across all of the queries during that 10-minute period, and we can calculate the difference, and that's the additional RTT, right? This may be an upper bound because it doesn't take into effect considerations like the recursive resolver's cache or the prefetching or something like that where a client is not waiting. So this is just the time between the resolver and the authorities, not really necessarily the time that a client will wait on a query. But we see that it can be large in some situations, right? 15% of these recursive resolvers are actually adding 50 milliseconds or more on average to their resolutions because of how they're distributing among the delegations. What if these recursive resolvers acted more like the ones that sent the vast majority of their traffic to one delegation, which I simulated in this curve? So this is a fairly sort of a straw man because I just picked an arbitrary implementation that sends all traffic to the lowest latency delegation, but it probes every single one of the 13 delegations every 5 minutes, so twice over the 10 minutes of logs. The added additional RTT dropped to 22 milliseconds in the top 15% of recursive resolvers. So there's an incremental improvement here by a change in the algorithm used by the recursive resolvers. There, of course, might be reasons why recursive resolvers don't do this today. And one of those is that spreading queries across multiple delegations adds entropy. And that's sort of the classic defense against cache poisoning attacks, right? That aside from DNS-SEC. So currently, you should get about 31 bits of entropy from just randomizing the source port and the transaction ID, assuming you're using half the port space. And as you can see from this curve, which I've showed you before, which is the entropy curve, the median recursive resolver is getting about 2.2 bits of entropy via the way they're distributing among the delegations. There are, of course, other ways to get an equivalent amount of entropy, and I just want to highlight two here. 0x20 encoding, right? Everything underneath COM, if you just encode COM itself, you get 3 bits of entropy right there. And then if you randomize the source IP address, which is probably more achievable in v6 than v4, with a pool of 16 IP addresses, you get 4 bits of entropy. So that's more than you would actually be able to achieve, even with a zone that has 13 delegations, like edgekey.net. So my point here really is there's alternatives that we can look at that don't have performance impact, that can achieve the same level of entropy. Okay, so let's return and talk about the rest of the recursive resolvers. There's limited data here, right? And that impairs our ability to identify their behavior. It would be really nice if we could say that what we know about the higher volume recursive resolvers from the perspective of Akamai applies to all recursive resolvers. And the way I'm going to attempt to show that is with this threshold, right? I picked this threshold somewhat arbitrarily. It's not really a very meaningful threshold. But if we look at the behavior of the recursive resolvers above the threshold versus the ones immediately below it, the ones in the range of 80 to 90 queries, we actually see it's quite similar. This is the entropy graph, again, for I think the third time. And we see that this distinct set of recursive resolvers with a different traffic volume actually looks like it behaves similarly to the higher volume recursive resolvers. And we can look at this in other metrics as well. Like here's the preference for the lower latency delegations. And again, the behavior looks quite similar here, right? This suggests that what we know, what we've learned about higher volume recursive resolvers seems to apply to all the recursive resolvers, which is good because when you zoom in on these lower volume recursive resolvers, you see that many of them are extremely low query rate. Actually, 60% sent less than 1 query per minute on average from this 10-minute period. So these account actually for 3% of all the DNS traffic that I captured. So it's not negligible. It's just that the large number of IPs here individually send very little traffic, but there's a very large number of them. So think about this, right? If they send 1 query per minute for 13 delegations, it's going to take them 13 minutes to get an estimate of RTT for all 13 delegations. By the time you've estimated the RTT for all of them, your RTT for the first one might already be stale. So you'll have to estimate again, which means no matter what you do algorithmically on the recursive resolver side, you can't kind of get beyond that limitation. So no improvements to the recursive resolver algorithm are likely to actually benefit these extremely low volume recursive resolvers. So to summarize then, the kind of the high points here is that a small number, less than 6.7% of recursive resolvers use the delegations uniformly. Around 10% of the ones contacting Akamai seem to send queries, all of their DNS traffic to a single delegation, and that's likely the lowest latency delegation. The remainder attempt to prefer lower latency delegations, and that can actually increase the average resolution time over alternatives. But the 60% of really the tail of recursive resolvers that send very little traffic have such low query rates that any algorithmic changes are unlikely to actually be beneficial to them. Which really leads me to 2 things, I think. The first is what informs our deployments on the authoritative side is that we really need to make sure that we maintain low latency for all delegations because recursive resolvers are going to use them all. And this agrees with past research, most particularly with the Muller et al. Paper from 2017. the other side, though, recursive resolver software can actually improve resolution time incrementally by using the fastest delegation for the vast majority of DNS queries, and this is most beneficial for higher volume recursive resolvers or recursive resolvers that send a lot of traffic for a particular domain. They can probe the other delegations rarely, and to me this is an open question because I don't really have data to speak to it. How frequently is frequently enough to update an estimate of RTT? So if anyone has an idea, please let me know. And then finally, we can use other methods for adding entropy to prevent cache poisoning attacks, or just use DNSSEC, whichever. And thank you, that's my talk.
So Warren Kamari, Google, if easy, can you go back to slide 23, I think? Only if easy, because I know the clicker is being entertaining. So 13 delegations seems like a very large number under something like this. And you have, I believe, many of your sites Anycast. It seems like you had a much smaller number of delegations, like on the order of 4, and have each one of your Anycast sites serve 3 out of the 4 addresses. You're going to get a much better distribution of latencies, like much, much better.
So yes, that's correct. The reason we have 13 really goes to our availability and resiliency model. So it's more of it's an architectural decision that I'm actually, to be honest, I'm not sure how much I can talk about.
George Michelson, APNIC. I would like to propose that you do an active experiment. You take one NS, you count the cohort of users in a 10-minute interval, and you add 50 milliseconds of delay to that NS, and you repeat the experiment for another 10 minutes and see if you can push the traffic to other NSs purely by the addition of delay. And if you can, then the only modified factor is the delay. And then put it back again and see if they come back over a 24-hour period.
Yes, I believe that, so I haven't done that obviously. I think it's a useful experiment, but I think the larger point here is that the recursive resolvers will preference the lower latency delegation, right? So if you add arbitrary delay to another one, but they won't stop using it entirely, right? So the average RTT will shift, but it will still be higher than if you just use the lower one.
Jim Reed, I wonder if you've given any thought to trying to fingerprint the recursive resolver servers that you're measuring the round trip times to, and see if you then correlate the resolver behavior with a particular DNS implementation?
So I have not attempted to fingerprint any of the recursive resolvers now, yeah, but that would be useful.
Yeah, Tail, actually along the same lines, one of the things I didn't see explicitly mentioned was how a number of different resolvers now are using banded smooth round trip times in order to also make the server selection not as predictable for attackers. And for example, one implementation who I think I know who it is, but I don't want to impugn them, and perhaps I'm wrong, actually use fairly wide bands of like 200 milliseconds. And so you might be seeing actually that within their algorithms, there are actually more of these resolvers that are picking what they consider to be their fastest resolvers or fastest authorities within the context of all of them being in the same 200 millisecond band. So you might think 190 milliseconds is awfully slow compared to your fastest responders, but to that resolver, they're actually equivalent.
Yes, I completely agree. I think I saw those kind of recursive resolvers in the delegation set. One of the things that I'm trying to motivate, I hope you agree with me or not, is that that kind of bounding to add entropy to the queries is really not necessary.
Hi, Oliver from Cloudflare. Thank you very much. This was very interesting. My first question was going to be, can you describe your Anycast advertisements, i.e. are they flat, are they very random around the world or what? So basically, what is the time difference from various resolvers to this different authoritative servers?
So I can tell you that all 13 are worldwide. They're announced worldwide. and they're from different physical locations, so it's quite common to actually see the latencies vary greatly among all 13 currently, which kind of shows up in some of the data I showed, yeah.
Yeah, I will echo Warren's comment that 13 is way too many. And at Cloudflare, we advertise all authoritative servers out of basically everywhere.
Okay.
The second one is you assume that a resolver will use one address, but then you mentioned that resolvers could use more to get entropy. Yeah, that's more common than you think. And also about what Dave just mentioned, the resolver that had this really wide band after a few months of beating up them, Ralph here, implemented a fastest N policy that allows us to concentrate on the fast one. So hopefully we'll see more and more resolvers going to the faster authoritative servers. But if you want to improve your authoritative service, decrease the number of addresses. And also please add the IPv6 data. That is interesting.
Thanks.
Hi, Puneet from Google Public DNS. So this was very interesting to see. Thanks for doing this. And as Olafur said, I think V6 will be interesting because you'll see disparities between V4 and V6 selection. And the one thing I would argue a little bit about is send all your traffic to the fastest authoritative server. Because especially from servers with very high volume, that could result in overloading the authoritative server. So you do need to spread it around.
So I did think about that, and one thing that generally seems to be true is because all of these are Anycast and more authorities seem to be moving towards Anycast, is that that distribution of traffic is already very non-uniform. It's very skewed as it is. So I'm not sure actually if individual recursive resolvers preferencing the lowest latency delegation would make it more skewed or not. It's kind of a gray area, right?
Yannis Labru with VeriSign. So one interesting work, by the way. One thing that messes up the data potentially is that your measurement of RTT is not through the same path that the query is sent in the first place. So you might have odd things that have significantly different paths. And one suggestion for this would be, since you know your sources and you can geolocate them to the lat long, calculate geodesic distance, and figure out if you have significant discrepancies between what you measure and what the distance is by region. So this might allow you.
The pings were all over the unicast address, right, back and forth, whereas the DNS traffic was coming in via Anycast. So I agree, the paths could vary significantly. And I actually did look at the geolocation and do this analysis via geolocation as well, but the general results didn't seem to vary greatly. It was really in the minor kind of bits that it changed.
Okay.
Thank you.
Oh.
Hi there, Brian Summers from OpenDNS. Just to echo what other folks have said, I would think that all resolvers have to band the RTTs. If they don't, then they're going to lose entropy. And it's going to be a pretty kind of wicked environment for the resolvers. Also, the V6 consideration is important. We certainly prefer V6 because it's a more secure protocol, especially in terms of fragments, etc. once DNS-SEC is implemented. Yeah, I mean, our bands are way bigger than Google's. They start at 350 milliseconds, so you won't see any unfair distribution unless you kind of start bumping up your RTTs to see what actually changes in behavior.
So I guess I would like to talk more about the bands with you later. Maybe we can meet in the hall. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Kyle. So our next speaker is Paul Hoffman from ICANN. Paul is going to be talking about a testbed for resolver and root queries.
Thank you. So the last talk was about the real world and collecting actual things. So let's go back into the imaginary world of testbeds. This talk is an introduction to a test bed that is still under development, although it's working well enough to talk to you about it. The purpose of the talk is to hopefully get interest from folks in the room about the test bed, and to, because the more people who look at test beds, the more people who play with it, the more goodness we can have. So I'll just talk a little bit about why the test bed was created, the kinds of tests that can be run in it, and then point out about the open development. So most people here are probably familiar with RSAC, the Root Server System Advisory Committee to the to the ICANN board. RSAC has a thing called a caucus, which many people in the room are already in. I'm not going to introduce that, but RSAC sometimes asks the caucus to do some work, and in this case, they created a work party called the Studying Modern Resolver Behaviors, spelled non-American, work party. And basically, it's the root server operators asking the caucus to start looking at how do resolvers interact with, and I will speak for them. They are probably most interested in how resolvers interact with the root server system. As we know, most resolvers interact with all authoritative servers the same to some extent. Given that the root zone also has the trust anchor, if you're testing DNS-SEC validation, that might be a little bit different. But so I gave a link to how you can find out more about the work party. I didn't actually put the URL in there because it's ICANN, and therefore all of our URLs are embarrassing. I do actually have a GitHub URL later because it's not embarrassing. But grab the slides if you're interested in the work party. And also, if you're interested in becoming a member of the RSAC caucus, I'll just say, talk to me later about that. But basically, the caucus is a good way to interact with the root servers, especially if you want to do research, that they will ask for things. So the next sentence is what the RSAC asked the caucus. They wanted a test bed to test both resolver and authoritative server code bases, although at this point the test bed is just for on the resolver side, to perform hopefully repeatable simulations. Here at OARC, we often get presentations where someone said, I did this, here are some numbers, but they aren't reproducible. And in fact, this specific work party is because this work has already been done 5 or 6 years ago. But the test bed for that work of looking at, captured resolvers, looking how they interact with the root, the test bed was lost. So I actually had to create this from scratch. However, since I'm making this open, then hopefully that doesn't happen in the future after I get run over by a bus. So this is to help model interactions, and so we can test things such as how does priming happen in the root? How does repriming happen? What happens if we change the DNS-SEC trust anchors, algorithm roles, blah, blah, blah. So again, this is not for real world testing. This is in a test bed environment. Good, now I get to the same problem. There we go. So, actually, did I skip one or not? Excuse me. Okay. So the test bed is not done at all. It's under active development. And the basic idea of the test bed is that it runs under VirtualBox, so any of you with a laptop open could be running the test bed on the laptop. It uses 3 virtual machines, one to test the resolver, so open source code in the resolver's VM. And we certainly intend this to be usable, so if someone wants to test a resolver that can't be run in the VM, such as a hardware one or something from the real world, as long as you can get the addressing right, that'll be usable. There's a gateway, mostly there to capture PCAPs, but also to keep all of the traffic that should be within the test bed. So we're using private address space to do that. And then there's a bespoke root server running in the third one so that the resolvers, when they are coming up and asking root queries, they've got a bespoke root hints file and a bespoke trust anchor so that they will always go to this machine. And we also have a way of creating bespoke routes, such as, like I say, changing the algorithm and such. So the first test that we were doing was exactly what the RSAC was looking for, which was to look at priming. So the way we do that, of course we don't want to run the test bed for 2 days for every test, is in the bespoke route, we actually have 60-second TTLs on the SOA and the NS and the DNS key. That we can change that around as well, but that means that, you know, testing bind 9.14.0 for its priming shouldn't, you know, will take about 2 minutes. Start it up, let it reprime in about a minute, let it reprime again, things like that. So, and then we're going to add more tests soon. The whole idea of this test bed, beyond answering the questions that RSAC asks, is you all might have questions. You might want to test some of this. So, and again, we hope that this is all reproducible. So here's a real URL. You can go grab that from GitHub. Basically, it has instructions on how to set it up. It is not an auto setup. We sort of figure if someone's going to want to run this, they're willing to spend about an hour doing the setup. But it should be pretty direct. We've already got a couple of people saying that, as far as they can tell, that the setup guide works for them. But as long as you have a copy of VirtualBox on whichever system and runs fine on Mac, and you know the ISOs needed, that this should just be fine. So again, even though the development is happening based on a request from RSAC Caucus, it's actually being developed, the testbed itself is being developed for the long term, so that if people have questions later, for those of you who were at IDS the other day, we had the KSK futures discussion. People were saying, well, we might want to use different algorithms for DNSSEC. You might be able to test that in the testbed. And just to be really clear, you don't actually have to be in the RSAC caucus, much less in the work party, to contribute. This is supposed to be an open and generally usable thing. So please go and grab it and let me know what you think. I believe that was the last slide. So any questions? I know it might be hard to ask questions if you haven't tried the testbed, but open to all questions.
RubensKuning.br. I have some concerns with changing the TTL because there could be some hard-coded parameters in software, like wait 60 seconds, wait 10 minutes or so. So instead of changing the TTL, you could change the time parameter of the virtual machine. You could say to VirtualBox, run that machine at 10 times, 100 times faster, and you would get the same quick response from the system.
So my response to that is, when you said you could and you would, what you mean to say is you would hope you could and you would hope you would. We actually did a lot of this testing. We tried to do time speedups for testing the KSK rollover a few years ago, and it worked some of the time and not at others. We actually gave up on that idea. That's why we went with the faster TTL. Now, to follow up on your first point, though, that there might be, like, within the software 60-second breaks or whatever. We could actually just respin this route with a 10-minute TTL. It just means every test would take 10 minutes. So that would, actually, that's something I intended to do. I was going to set it at an hour. Because, you know, with 30 or 40 different pieces of software, it doesn't matter if it takes 2 days to run it. And that, you know, try it at 60 seconds, try it at an hour, see whether you get the same results. The PCAPs should look identical, and we can see if they are or not.
Okay.
Yep. Yep. And if you have more questions about changing the time, go talk to Warren.
Ralph Weber, Akamai. So one thing that we discovered here and had lots of talk at OARC was that a lot of the problems that we have in recursing these stuff is middle boxes that are in the way. So is there any plans to do the stuff like
Sure.
represent some of the middle box behavior, like not fragmenting and I mean, cutting at certain packet size, stuff like that.
Yeah, so we have 3 VMs right now, but there's no reason not to make the left-hand VM actually 2 VMs, the real one, the resolver and a middle box. That would be perfectly easy to do. That kind of testing should work directly with the test bed layout as is now. And if not, I'm fine with making the test bed more complicated in general in order to catch things like that.
We would have to define some of the cases that we see in kind of probably IP filters or something that does it.
Sure, we can either emulate IP filters, or like I say, the test bed should handle actual hardware, so you could have like, a VM hardware going through a crappy middle box. Yes, so that would actually be interesting testing that we could do. Thanks. Yeah.
So, Hazel Smith. So I realize some of these questions may well be answered by me looking at the GitHub, but I didn't get as far as getting my laptop out, so my apologies. Does it do v6? You mentioned private addressing. Does it do v6?
Oh, God. Thank you, Hazel. It doesn't now, but it can, and it would be trivial to make it happen. I don't have v6 at my house.
I do? Do you accept pull requests?
No. I will do my own. Even as we speak, AT&T is digging trenches in front of my house, and apparently in the US, if you get ATT, you get IPv6. So that should be fixed within a month. But no, currently, if you look at it, it's extremely v4-centric, and that was strictly for selfish reasons.
Okay, and the test...
By the way, I'm sorry, let me just say also, on the RSAC side, the person who is coordinating this is Fred Baker, who is Dr. IPv6. So you're not the only one asking for me to do this in v6.
Okay, and read the testing. I realize that some of it is produce PCAPs, look at them later, but is it automated in the sense of it kicks off these resolvers and...
Absolutely. So as it stands right now, you can, in your test, say, I want to test these individual resolvers or all of them.
Okay.
And we're going to have finer granularity later.
Okay, and are you doing any kind of, say, sanity checking, any kind of sort of automated testing, such as server spec, RSpec, anything like that, to sort of say, did this actually work, or just waiting for human review of the PCAPs?
Not currently. Currently, the testing is done as a list of digs, to kick off. I could. That would be a lot more complicated. I would need to have a good motivation on that. I was figuring there was going to be a human looking at the PCAPs afterwards who would notice if it was all wrong for some reason.
Fair play. Thank you for your answer.
Yep.
This is Akira Kato from White Project, Japan. Very similar to the question about the middle box issue, but in the rare case that the behavior could be changed on IPv4 and IPv6, and so in the root server operator, what is the correct behavior is a big question. So if you have any opportunity, please try to have the variety of the server-side implementation on the packet size and what the client behaves. That'd be very interesting.
I absolutely agree, and as it turns out, one of the things that happened, and the reason why the development has taken a while, was I was having just a hell of a time trying to get on the server side, trying to get Linux to do the right thing to have 13 IP addresses, because right now the test bed does actually make it look like that there are 13 root servers, all of which, by the way, have a slightly different delay. I thought we might as well test, so one has 100 millisecond delay, 200 millisecond delay, and so on. In doing that, I had to abandon Linux and go to FreeBSD for that box. In doing that, that actually lets me do a lot of the things like you're asking, so on the server side, it can be fragmenting just these 4 root servers. Let's see what happens when that happens. Delaying, sending out bad IPv6. That's all now really easy to do. I'm not sure how I would do that for an individual test to say do that, but because that box now is running FreeBSD and therefore the packet throttling is a lot better, I think that we can do this kind of test. So if you have specific ones that you've seen from JPRS of, we don't know why this is happening, send me what seems to be your problem cases, and I'll see if I can, work up a test there. And then again, we can just run through all the resolvers against that. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. So yes, so please do contribute, or even if you just look at it and you don't want to run it, but you say, oh, I wish that you would test X, by all means get in touch with me, or open up issues on GitHub. That's another good way for other people if you have a desired test you want me to run and you open up a GitHub issue, other people looking at the repo will say, oh, that's good, but I also want this. So thank you.
Okay, just a couple of quick announcements before we break. We will restart at 11 a.m., just a slightly shorter break than usual to catch up. Again, if you have any food allergies or concerned about what's on offer, please speak to Dinesh at the registration desk. If you want to go to the social tonight and you haven't got a ticket, please can you register online for a ticket before the start of lunch, and we'll be distributing boarding passes during the afternoon break. I mentioned that Matt Pouncett will be doing a PGP signing session tomorrow, lunchtime. Matt would just like to say a couple of words about preparing for that.
Thanks, Keith. Like at many other OARC events, we're going to run a PGP key signing party during lunch tomorrow. For those who would like to participate, if you could email an ASCII armored copy of your public key to pgpsign, all one word, at DNS-OARC.net by midnight tonight. I'll put together the keychain for that tomorrow that people will be able to download after morning break, and then we can run the signing during lunch. If anybody has any questions about that, please come and find me, and I can fill you in on anything you need to know. Thanks.
Okay, coffee break until 11 a.m.